Hello and welcome to the Biology 6 lecture on the urinary system. This is part 1 of that lecture. We're going to begin our discussion of the urinary system by showing some of the major organs of the urinary system.
Now, right here at the beginning of the lecture outline, it doesn't list all these organs that I'm about to name for you. The organs I'm about to name here in the picture, they are in your lecture outline, but they're not here on the first page. I just wanted to introduce you to the major organs of the urinary system, and then we'll go through them one at a time, talking about how they function. Okay, so the organs of your urinary system, these two ones they're showing in brown right here and right here are the kidneys. Their job is, or I should say, one of the things they do is to make the urine. So the urine is manufactured in your kidneys. And then each kidney has a urine drainage tube called a ureter, where the urine is carried downward. So, here's the person's left kidney, and here's their left ureter that carries urine downward from their left kidney. And here's the person's right kidney, and here's their right ureter carrying the urine downward from their right kidney. The two ureters carry the urine downward and store it in this organ right here. This is called the urinary bladder, or sometimes just the bladder for short. So the urine is stored in the bladder until it's convenient for you to go to the bathroom. And then when you do go to the bathroom, the last tube that the urine passes through as it's exiting your body is called the urethra. You can see that little tube that comes out the bottom of the bladder there is the urethra, the final tube that the urine goes through as it passes out of your body. Okay, so those are the organs of your urinary system, your two kidneys, each with its own ureter, and then the urinary bladder, and then the urethra down at the bottom. All of these organs are important, but the kidneys are the most important of these organs. And the reason I say that is the kidneys, they make the urine, but they make the urine from substances that they remove from the blood. So the kidneys connect with your blood, and what the kidneys are actually doing is cleaning and balancing the blood. Think of the urine as basically the trash can for the kidneys as they clean and balance your blood. If you're going to clean your car this afternoon, you're going to go through your car and remove a bunch of stuff that you don't want in your car, and typically you'll throw that in a trash can. Well, the kidneys' real job is to clean and balance the blood, and so the kidneys just use the urine as their trash can to get rid of the stuff that they remove from the blood. So, the true importance of the kidneys is not so much that they make the urine. The true importance is that they clean and balance the blood. The other organs of the urinary system, like the Gesundheit, the ureters and the bladder and the urethra, they do not clean and balance the blood. Those organs of the urinary system just channel the urine and store the urine. That's not as critical as what the kidneys are doing, which is cleaning and balancing the blood. And so that's why I'm saying that the kidneys are the most important organs of your urinary system. Okay, so the kidneys, their real job, their most important job is cleaning and balancing the blood. Let's first talk a little bit about the blood, and once we review a little bit about the blood, then we'll come back to the kidneys and talking about what exactly do we mean when we say the kidneys clean and balance the blood. Okay, we've been talking about the blood pretty much all semester. About 4 weeks ago, we did a chapter on the blood, and so let me review some of the key concepts. When we learned about the blood, we learned that the blood had two essentially major parts to it. There were the blood cells and the liquidy part of the blood. Who remembers what's the official name for the blood cells? It's kind of a funny phrase that means the blood cells. I think I heard it begins with an F. No, formed elements. Formed elements. Yeah, so the phrase the formed elements means your blood cells. And I always thought that was kind of funny. Why not just call them the blood cells? I don't know, but in anatomy speak, the phrase formed elements means your blood cells. And so your blood cells are your red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The other part of your blood is the liquidy, watery part. And who remembers the name of that? That's the plasma. Very good. Good. So your blood cells and your plasma together make up your blood. There we go. So I'm using that red cell to represent all the blood cells. Of course, you have red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets as your formed elements, but I'll just symbolize all the formed element types by showing a red blood cell. So that represents the formed elements in the blood. The plasma is mostly water, and so that's why I'm showing some water molecules there. Now, focusing in on the plasma, the plasma is mostly water, but there are a lot of other molecules that are dissolved in the plasma. For instance, there are a lot of proteins that are dissolved in the plasma of the blood. What are those proteins? Well, we've talked about some of them just a few minutes ago. Antibodies are a common type of protein that's found in the blood. There are also things called clotting factors, which are proteins that help your blood clot when you've cut yourself. The most abundant plasma protein is one called albumin. In addition to the blood proteins, the plasma also has ions. Ions are electrically charged atoms or molecules, and we've been talking about these ions throughout the semester, like sodium ions, potassium ions, or you might remember are important for the proper functioning of your nervous system. Calcium ions are used for muscle contraction, and of course bones also contain a lot of calcium ions. The hydrogen ion concentration of your blood sets your blood's pH. There's just a whole slew of different ions that are dissolved in your plasma. And there's also a lot of what I'm calling nutrients dissolved in the plasma. The most abundant of them is glucose. That's that sugar, that monosaccharide that provides energy to your cells. There are also amino acids dissolved in the plasma. Those are the building blocks of proteins. There are fatty acids dissolved in your plasma. Those are the building blocks of lipids. There are vitamins dissolved in the plasma. And in addition to all that, there are also some wastes in the plasma. Wastes are molecules that your body doesn't want or need and eventually needs to get rid of. Now, there are actually many different types of wastes that are carried in the plasma, but the most abundant type are called nitrogen-containing wastes. And that just means wastes where the waste molecule contains a nitrogen atom as part of its structure. And yeah, there are several different of these nitrogen-containing wastes. One common one is called urea. There's another one called uric acid. Now, there's kind of an interesting backstory about these nitrogen-containing wastes in the plasma, and let me tell you what it is. Oh, yeah, so in my diagrams, I'm just going to use urea as an example of one of these nitrogen-containing wastes, but bear in mind there are other nitrogen-containing wastes in the plasma, like uric acid. Anyway, so there's kind of an interesting backstory about these nitrogen-containing wastes, and let me tell you what it is. So in this diagram, these circles here represent the trillions of cells in the body. And this red thing is supposed to be a blood vessel, and of course the liver there represents the liver. Well, during the normal, proper, healthy functioning of your cells, they generate a nitrogen-containing waste called ammonia. There you see that NH3 right there is ammonia. And so the cells dump this ammonia, nitrogen-containing waste, into the plasma. But the problem is ammonia is pretty toxic. And so your liver's job is to detoxify that ammonia as quickly as possible. And so that's what your liver does. Your liver is constantly taking the ammonia out of the blood and detoxifying it by changing it into urea, which is another nitrogen-containing waste. But urea is a lot less toxic than the ammonia is. So yeah, so this is constantly going on in your body. Your cells are continuously making ammonia, dumping it into the bloodstream, and the liver is constantly taking it in and detoxifying it by converting it into that much less toxic nitrogen-containing waste, urea. But even though urea is less toxic than ammonia, your body still has to get rid of the urea, otherwise it would just pollute your blood. Okay, so here is what I'm going to use to represent the contents of your blood, or at least some of the contents of your blood. Ions, like the ions I'm showing there, and nutrients, like I'll use glucose to represent all the nutrients in your blood, and I'll use urea to represent all these nitrogen-containing wastes in the blood. Okay, so think of that as representing the blood, and of course the blood cells also. I guess I don't have them in this cartoon, but the blood obviously also contains blood cells. All right, so getting back to the kidneys. So the job of the kidneys is to clean and balance the blood. Clean means getting rid of the wastes. So when we say the kidneys clean the blood, that essentially means they have to get rid of the urea out of the blood. Balance means to adjust the good things, like the nutrients and the ions, to their proper levels, because the nutrients and the ions, and actually the water content of the blood itself, can become out of balance, and that will be a bad thing if you have too much or too little of these ions or the glucose or even the water in your blood. So notice the distinction there. When we say clean, that relates to the bad stuff, the nitrogen-containing stuff, the stuff that's just the body just wants to get rid of completely. Whereas when we say balance, that relates to the good stuff, the ions and the nutrients and the water in the blood. The body needs those to be in the blood, but they're supposed to be at their proper homeostatic concentrations. They're supposed to be in balance. And so the kidneys clean the blood. That means get rid of the urea and other waste, and balance means just adjust the water and ion and pH and nutrient levels to their proper healthy levels. Okay, so how do the kidneys clean and balance the blood? Well, that's what a lot of this lecture on the urinary system is going to be about. It's actually kind of a complicated process how the kidneys clean and balance the blood. But what I want to do now is take around 5 minutes or so to give a very simplified overview of how the kidneys clean and balance the blood. Now, as I just said, cleaning means getting rid of the wastes in the blood. In other words, cleaning the blood essentially means getting rid of the urea. And balancing means adjusting the water and ions and nutrients to their proper healthy levels. And to illustrate balancing the blood, I want to give a scenario where the blood becomes out of balance, and I'll use sodium as an example. So let's imagine that you, for some reason, love salty foods. You know, salty foods are high in sodium, and so every chance you get, you just pour salt on popcorn so it looks like a snowstorm has landed on your popcorn, and then you just eat all that salty popcorn because you just love salt for some reason. Well, so you're going to be out of balance for sodium, right? You'll have way too much sodium in your blood. And so that's how I'm going to symbolize that. Notice there are two sodium atoms there, two sodium ions. And so we'll say that this is your blood and you're out of balance for sodium. You have too much sodium. Okay, so the kidney's job is to clean the blood to get rid of the urea and to balance the blood, which in this example means getting rid of that extra sodium there. Okay, so here's the way it works. So your blood circulates throughout your body, and each kidney has some blood vessels that carry blood into it. So each kidney receives blood from your cardiovascular system, and the kidney's job is to clean and balance that blood. So how do the kidneys do that? Well, inside each kidney are some microscopic tubules called nephrons, and that's what I'm showing in yellow here. And so just so you know, each kidney has about 1 million of these nephrons inside of it, and so they're microscopic, and I'm just showing one of them. Well, these nephrons are the structures in the kidney that clean and balance the blood. So they are the part of the kidney, the structures in the kidney that actually do the cleaning and balancing of the blood. Okay, so let's see how these nephrons in the kidney clean and balance the blood. So there's that blood vessel, and it's got the ions and nutrients and water and the wastes like urea. Here it comes. Well, when the blood arrives in the kidneys, the blood is passed from the kidneys, or I should say the liquid part of the blood that has these dissolved solutes, that liquid part of the blood passes from the blood into the interior of the nephrons. The nephrons are hollow tubules. And so that step, the liquid part of the blood entering into the nephron, is called the filtration step. So we say that the liquid part of the blood filters into the nephron, like you see here. Good. Once the liquid part of the blood has filtered into the nephron, once the filtration step has occurred, the second step is that the nephrons reabsorb the proper amounts of solute molecules and water back into the blood. And reabsorb just means to transport those molecules back into the blood. But only the proper balanced amounts of the nutrients and ions and water are put back. There we go, the reabsorption step. Yeah. The balanced amounts of the nutrients and ions and water are put back. What's not reabsorbed back into the blood is the wastes like the urea and any excess water or ions or nutrients. Any excess water, ions, and nutrients are just not reabsorbed. And so look at the blood up here. Notice it's cleaned because the nephron did not reabsorb the waste urea back into the blood, so no urea there, so that's clean blood. And notice that blood is balanced now because the nephron did not reabsorb any excess solutes or water back in the blood. It didn't reabsorb that excess amount of sodium back. And so, yeah, by only reabsorbing balanced amounts of these solutes and not reabsorbing wastes or any excess amounts of those solutes, the nephrons in the kidney have cleaned and balanced your blood. Does that sound good so far? So what do you think happens to the stuff that's not reabsorbed that the body wants to get rid of? What does that turn into? The urine, right? Because like I said, the urine is the trash can. Like if you clean your room, you end up with or your car, you end up with some stuff you want to get rid of that you've cleaned out of your car. You throw it into the trash can. The nephrons throw that into the urine, or saying the same thing a different way. The urine is the stuff that's now in the nephron that was not reabsorbed, and that stuff is the waste and any excess solutes and excess water. That becomes the urine. There it goes. Okay, yeah, so you'll eventually just urinate those wastes and any excess water and solutes out of your body in the urine. All right, so if you've got that, you have the big picture of how the nephrons in the kidney clean and balance your blood. But as I said, there's a lot of details, but that's the central idea. So I was trying to make an analogy here. If you ever bought one of these steam cleaners, it removes the dirt and grime from your floor, and it puts it into this hot liquid inside the steam cleaner itself. So think of that as the urine. Yeah, so your goal when you clean your house is to remove junk from your floor, just like the kidney's job is to remove wastes and excess things from the blood. So I guess the floor is the blood, and the dirty liquid you end up inside your steam cleaner that contains the stuff you sucked off your floors, like the urine. All right, so as I was saying a few minutes ago, all the organs of the urinary system are important, but the kidneys are the most important because they clean and balance the blood. The other organs, like the ureters and the bladder and the urethra, they just kind of store and transport the urine, but they're not really cleaning or balancing the blood, so they're not as important as the kidneys are. So we're going to now dive into the anatomy of the kidneys in a little bit more detail. I think I've got a close-up of one kidney. Actually, let me show you where they are first. So the kidneys are in your abdominal cavity, but they're in the superior posterior part of your abdominal cavity. Posterior means towards the back, so they're more towards the back of your abdominal cavity, and they're kind of high up in the abdominal cavity. So we say they're in the superior part of the abdominal cavity. Here's a view of this person's back. As you can see, his kidneys are about the level of the lowest rib. So if you can sort of feel in your own back, the lowest ribs you can feel, that's about where your kidneys are. So the pair of kidneys, organs about the lowest rib that clean and balance the blood. Now, I think I'm just going to show one kidney here. Yeah, here's one kidney. The different regions of the kidney have different names, and I'll go through these different regions of the kidney here in just a moment. But before I do, I want to kind of skip over to this paragraph and talk about some structures that are connected to the kidneys. So these structures are not technically part of the kidney, but they are things that connect to the kidney. Okay, so in red right here, you see a blood vessel. That's called the renal artery. And the renal artery brings blood into the kidney. That's the blood that needs to be cleaned and balanced. That's the dirty, unbalanced blood that's being sent to the kidney, and that's carried in the renal artery. And so then that blood, flows into the kidney, and the nephrons in the kidney clean and balance that blood. And so the cleaned and balanced blood that is now coming out of the kidney, that's carried in the renal vein. So renal artery carries blood into the kidney, renal vein takes blood out of the kidney. The blood going in is the blood that needs to be cleaned and balanced, and the blood that comes out here in the renal vein is the cleaned and balanced blood. Now, like I've been saying, that the substances that the kidney removes from the blood as it cleans and balances the blood become the urine. And so the kidney generates the urine as it's cleaning and balancing the blood going in and changing it into the clean and balanced blood coming out. The kidney generates the urine, and so there needs to be a tube to carry the urine away from the kidney, and that's the ureter right there. The ureter drains the urine down out of each kidney. Now there's one more structure that's attached to the kidney, and that's the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland we talked about when we did the endocrine system. It's an endocrine gland. It secretes a whole bunch of different hormones, including glucocorticoids. It secretes a hormone called aldosterone. It secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's a good idea, of course, to review for the final exam. So when you're reviewing the endocrine system lecture, you'll see we talk all about the adrenal gland. We're not going to talk about the adrenal gland too much in this lecture on the urinary system, because it's really a separate organ than the kidney. The adrenal gland does not clean and balance the blood. It does not make any urine. It just happens to be located on top of each kidney. So other than mentioning that it's right there, it doesn't really come up too much in this lecture. Okay, so anyway, renal artery, renal vein, ureter, and the adrenal gland are structures that are actually connected to the kidney, but let's learn the actual names of the parts of the kidney itself. Okay, well, the kidney has three regions. Oh, so I've gotten rid of the renal artery and renal vein and the adrenal gland here, just to make the diagram clear. The kidney has three major parts. This outer part right here is called the cortex of the kidney. This middly part right here that's just under the cortex is called the medulla of the kidney. And this hollow region right here is called the renal pelvis. So cortex, medulla, and renal pelvis are your three major parts of the kidneys, regions of the kidneys. The cortex is the outermost region. If the kidney was an orange, the cortex would be the skin of the orange, the rind of the orange. And what's important about the cortex is that's where the nephrons are located. And so remember, the nephrons are these microscopic tubules. The liquid part of the blood filters into the nephron, and then by reabsorbing only the balanced amounts of solutes, the nephrons clean and balance the blood and make the urine. And so all that activity, the cleaning and balancing of the blood by the nephrons, all of that takes place in the cortex of your kidneys. Moving inward from the cortex, this kind of middle region right here is called the medulla of the kidney, and I'll talk about what that's doing here in just a moment. And then moving inward even further, the hollow region there is called the renal pelvis. Okay, so yeah, cortex, medulla, and renal pelvis. Going back to the medulla for a second, notice that the medulla looks like it has two different types of zones to it. Actually, let me click back one slide. Hold on one second. Okay, so notice the medulla looks like it has two different types of zones. Some parts of the medulla have these brown stripy looking areas, these kind of almost triangular shaped areas that have these brown stripes. And other parts of the medulla don't have them. They just look like, well, more normal looking tissue like here and here and there. Well, the parts that are kind of triangular shaped that look like they're made out of these brown stripes, those are called renal pyramids. And so in this diagram of the kidney, there's a renal pyramid, there's a renal pyramid, there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one. It looks like in this diagram, it looks like there's 7 or so renal pyramids that are being shown. What are those renal pyramids? Well, they are, each of those little brown stripes, you know, that makes up each renal pyramid is a structure called a collecting duct. And the collecting ducts channel the urine from the cortex to the renal pelvis. So remember that it's in the cortex where you find the nephrons, and you know the nephrons are what make the urine by cleaning and balancing the blood. But that urine, the urine that's formed there in the renal cortex has to travel down through the medulla to get to the renal pelvis so it can drain out of the kidney. And so those collecting ducts, those little brown stripes there, are what you find in the renal pyramids. The renal pyramids are just bundles of collecting ducts, and the collecting ducts channel the urine from the cortex down to the renal pelvis. Okay, so those are the renal pyramids. They are the clusters of collecting ducts to channel the urine inward. Oh, yeah, there you see the little yellow arrows representing the urine moving through those renal pyramid collecting ducts, and eventually down into the renal pelvis, and then the urine drains out of the renal pelvis and goes down the ureter to the bladder. So in between the renal pyramids, you have these zones of the medulla, which are obviously not renal pyramids. They don't have any of those stripy collecting ducts. Those are called renal columns. And the renal columns of the medulla are for blood vessels. So getting back here to this view of the blood vessels, notice if you look at these renal column areas, you can see blood vessels passing through them. And so that's what you find in the renal columns, or blood vessels moving blood back and forth to the cortex, whereas the renal pyramids are just for urine moving from the cortex inward into the renal pelvis. All right, well, so we are now going to, now that you know the 3 regions of the kidney, we're going to zoom in on the cortex and take a closer look at the nephrons there, cleaning and balancing the blood. All right, so let's brace yourself for a little complexity here as we zoom in on the cortex. All right, so actually let me, after all that build-up, let me go backwards for a second. Go back. Here we go. Okay, so this blood vessel shown in red right here is carrying blood into the kidney, the blood that needs to be cleaned and balanced. Who remembers the name of that blood vessel? Renal artery, yeah. The word renal means kidney. And so that's the renal artery. Yeah, it's bringing blood into the kidney. And so notice that as soon as that renal artery reaches the kidney, the renal artery starts branching into smaller arteries, right? You can see it branching there. And those smaller arteries pass through the renal columns of the medulla, and then they continue to branch. When we zoom in a little bit now, you'll see that each of these smaller arteries is continuing to branch into smaller arteries still, like there, and here you see some of these smaller arteries. Those tiny little arteries where the blood is arriving in the cortex, those smallest arteries are called afferent arterioles. And I know I have that in here somewhere, but now I don't see it. Well, I'll find it. It's in here somewhere. So the afferent arterioles are the smallest arteries in the kidney, and you find them in the cortex. All right. So think of the blood that's in each of those afferent arterioles is blood that needs to be cleaned and balanced, because that's the blood that comes in the renal artery. Okay, so you're like, there's an afferent arteriole, and there's an afferent arteriole, and there's one, and there's one, and there's one, and there's one. At the end of each afferent arteriole, you find, oh, I guess I got it labeled right there. So like, there's an afferent arteriole. At the end of each afferent arteriole, you'll find a nephron structure. So what I'm showing in yellow there is a nephron. All right, so the nephrons, just to recap, are found in the renal cortex, the cortex of the kidney, and you find one nephron at the end of each afferent arteriole. And incidentally, the word afferent means moving towards, and you can see why they call it that, because that blood in the afferent arteriole is moving towards the nephron. Now, in my cartoon here, I'm only showing one nephron, the one that's located at the end of this afferent arteriole. But there are actually about 1 million nephrons in each kidney's cortex. And so even though I'm not really showing it, at the end of each afferent arteriole is one nephron. Matter of fact, let me add a few more here, just so you get an idea. There you go. Yeah, at the end of each and every afferent arteriole, you'll find one nephron. And so, and there's about 1 million of these nephrons total in the cortex of each kidney. And just to keep the diagram simple, I'm just going to show one afferent, the nephron at the end of only this afferent arteriole, but again, keep in mind that each afferent arteriole has its own nephron. All right, yes, so here we see the blood moving through this afferent arteriole that's being brought towards this nephron right there, so the nephron can clean and balance that blood. Okay, so here's my own cartoon of a nephron. So the nephron begins right there, and it's kind of got this loopity part right there, and then that's the official end of the nephron right there. Now, the nephron, in my imagination, looks a bit like a snake. Here's the head of the snake. It looks like its mouth open as if it's going to be striking at somebody. Pardon me. And then I guess there's the neck of the snake and kind of the body of the snake like that. Yeah. At least in my imagination, that's how I think of the nephron looking. Each nephron has 4 parts to it, 4 regions to it. And the 4 regions of the nephron are listed here. I'm going to just quickly click through the names of these 4 regions of the nephron. And we'll come back later and talk about exactly what goes on in each of those 4 regions of the nephron. But let's just do the names. So the part that looks like the head of the snake, the beginning of the nephron right there, is called the glomerular capsule. Some older textbooks call it Bowman's capsule, which is its older name, but the more current name is the glomerular capsule. This part right here, which I think of as the neck of the snake, the part right behind glomerular capsule, is called the proximal convoluted tubule of the nephron. The part that loops downward and then back up like that is called the nephron loop. Some older textbooks call it the loop of Henle, which is the older name for it. And then the last part of the nephron, this part that straightens out right here, is called the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so each nephron's got glomerular capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, and distal convoluted tubule. So the distal convoluted tubule is the official end of the nephron. But notice that at the end, the nephron connects to this tube right here. That's called a collecting duct. So the collecting duct is not officially considered part of it's not part of the nephron. The nephron's connecting to it, but it is not officially considered part of the nephron. All righty. Well, So here in a second, I'm going to start telling you about what these 4 parts of the nephron exactly do. But before we get to that, I have to go back to the blood vessels again for a second. So here you see some branches of the renal artery. That's carrying the blood that needs to be cleaned and balanced. And of course, those eventually branch into these afferent arterioles, which also carry the blood that needs to be cleaned and balanced. And so notice right at the end of this afferent arteriole, I have a little red ball-shaped thing that's right next to the glomerular capsule of the nephron. That little red ball-shaped thing at the end of the afferent arteriole is called a glomerulus, and it's a round capillary bed. So in your lecture handout, there's the next paragraph says collecting ducts, and if you go down a little further, here it is, capillaries that are associated with the nephron, the glomerulus, a ball of capillaries at the end of each afferent arteriole is a glomerulus. And I think we have a close-up of it. Yeah, here it is. And so here's the afferent arteriole right here. So the afferent arteriole brings blood into this glomerulus round capillary bed. Okay, so quick review question. So there's the glomerulus, this round capillary bed. What's this part of the nephron called that surrounds it? Glomerular capsule. And you can see where it gets its name from because it encapsulates the glomerulus. The glomerulus is the round capillary bed, and the part of the nephron that encapsulates it, that surrounds it, is the glomerular capsule. Matter of fact, there you see it. So I guess it kind of makes sense in its own way, right? So notice that the glomerulus is not officially considered part of the nephron. The glomerulus is a capillary bed, and that's different from the nephron. But nevertheless, the glomerulus is right there, right next to the start of the nephron. The glomerulus is right next to the glomerular capsule. Okay, the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus together are called a renal corpuscle. So when I use that phrase, renal corpuscle, think of this right here. The renal corpuscle is glomerulus plus glomerular capsule. Is the renal corpuscle significant? Yeah, it is, because that's where the filtration step takes place. Remember, when we say the filtration, that means where the liquid part of the blood is entering the nephron. So the renal corpuscle, the glomerulus plus the glomerular capsule together, are the filter where the blood filters into the nephron. Or I should say, where the liquid part of the blood filters into the nephron. Now, let me go on a slight tangent here. If you were to look at a kidney cortex under the microscope, you can actually see these renal corpuscles pretty clearly in the cortex of the kidney under the microscope. And a few years back, we got some money from a grant, and we used it to buy a microscope that can take pictures of our microscope slides. And I just thought that was the cat's pajamas, and I went crazy for it. For a couple of weeks, I was looking at every microscope slide we had and said, oh, this is so cool. I'm going to take a lot of pictures of this and show them to my class. And so I kind of went off the deep end, and I took like dozens of pictures of renal corpuscles in the kidneys. And I have to confess, I was kind of proud of them. I thought they turned out kind of nicely. And so now I'm going to bore you for a minute or two and show you these pictures that I took. And so here's the cortex of a kidney right here under the microscope. And you can see these little round structures like here and here and here and here. Those are renal corpuscles. And zooming in a little bit, you can begin to see them. Like here is the glomerulus, here's the capillary bed, and this C-shaped white area that surrounds it is the glomerular capsule. That's the start of the nephron. And like here's one here. Here's the glomerulus in kind of red, and the C-shaped white area that surrounds it is the beginning of the nephron, the renal corpuscle. And there you see them there. Oh, there's a great picture right there. So glomerulus, capillary bed there, glomerular capsule of the nephron is there. And I think you can see the beginning of the proximal convoluted tubule right there. You know, that's the next part of the nephron. Anyway, I just thought I would just brag and impress you with my photographs. So But here's the cartoon version. Okay, so if you look closely at the wall of the glomerulus, in fact, let me zoom in here. So here's the glomerulus, and so these pink cells are the wall of the glomerulus. Notice there's little gaps between the pink cells, right? Like here's a little gap, and here's a gap, and here's a gap. And similarly, the yellow cells are the wall of the glomerular capsule. There's also gaps. There's matching gaps between those cells. And so there's little gaps right here where the liquid part of the blood can filter into the nephron. These little gaps are where the smaller molecules in the blood can filter out of the blood and go into the nephron. And so I tried to capture that thought, not there, but here. Okay, so the glomerular capsule is the enlarged end of the nephron, and it encloses, in other words, it surrounds the glomerulus. And together, the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus together act as the filter to allow the smaller molecules of the blood to filter into the nephron. And so I kind of expanded on that concept right here. Let me just first give the official definition of filtration. Imagine that this represents some sort of membrane, and it has little holes in it. You know, so it's like imagine this as being like a piece of Swiss cheese or something. It has these little round holes in it. And we say that that's a porous membrane. Porous means it has little holes in it. All right, and on this side, imagine some molecules of different sizes. Some of these are large molecules, some of these are smaller molecules. All right, well, if there's some pressure on this side, that's going to try to get the molecules to fit through, right? And I think you can see that the smaller molecules are going to be able to fit through there, right? But the larger ones can't because they're just too big to fit through those holes. And so that's the essence of what filtration is. Filtration is defined as the selective passage of molecules through a porous membrane based on the size of the molecule. Selective passage means some molecules can pass through, but some can't. And what determines whether they can pass through or not is simply their size. If they're small enough to fit through the little holes, they can filter through. And if they're too large, then they can't filter through. And so, yeah, that's what goes on here in the renal corpuscle, which again means the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule. Because of those little gaps right there, the smaller molecules of the blood can filter into the nephron, but the larger molecules of the blood can't filter into the nephron because they're just too large. So yeah, the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus together make the renal corpuscle, which is the filter. And so let's now discuss, well, which molecules of the blood are small enough to filter into the nephron and which molecules in the blood are too large to filter into the nephron. Well, the too large, it's easier to describe which ones are too large to filter into the nephron because it's just two types, the blood cells and the blood proteins. And so those are the only parts of the blood that are too big to filter into the nephron, the blood cells and blood proteins. And so here we see an example. Here's a blood cell, or I guess I should say a formed element. Formed elements, blood cells do not filter into the nephron. They're just too big to make it through the little gaps. And that's supposed to be a blood protein. Same thing. Blood proteins are just a little too big to fit through. So you don't get blood cells and blood proteins filtering into the nephron. But those are really the only parts of the blood that are too big to filter through. All the other solutes in the blood are small enough to fit into the nephron or to fit through those gaps. And so all the other parts of the blood do filter into the nephron. So what molecules are we talking? Water molecules can filter into the nephron. All of those ions that we talked about are small enough to filter into the nephron. Yeah. Yeah. You would think. I haven't finished the drawing yet, but there's an exit vessel called an efferent arteriole that takes them away. So it's a great question, but I haven't finished my diagram yet. So water is small enough to filter through. The ions in the blood are small enough to filter through. The nutrients in the blood, like glucose, are small enough to filter through. And the nitrogen-containing waste, like urea, is also small enough to filter through. And so like I said, almost all the blood can filter through. And since water can filter through, this is a liquid that is filtering into the nephron. And we call that liquid, that step is called filtration. This is the filtration step. And the liquid that does enter into the nephron is called the filtrate. The liquid that passes out of the blood and goes into the nephron, we call that liquid in the nephron, we call that the filtrate. Cool, yeah, so the filtrate is water from the blood, ions from the blood, nutrients from the blood, and wastes like urea from the blood, but the filtrate is not blood cells or proteins, because those are just too big to filter in. So yeah, excellent question a second ago. What happens to the blood that doesn't filter in? There's an exit blood vessel called an efferent arteriole. Let's see if I have that here. Oh, it's on the next page. Hold on. Yeah, so getting back here to this glomerulus ball of capillaries at the end of the afferent arteriole, smaller molecules of blood are filtered into the glomerulus, into the nephron. The blood that does not filter into the nephron exits the glomerulus through this other little blood vessel here called the efferent arteriole right there. So afferent arteriole brings the blood into the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole carries the blood that has not filtered into the nephron out of the glomerulus. Okay, so when I click the button, we're going to see these various substances move in various directions. The blood that did not filter into the nephron exits the glomerulus in the efferent arteriole. I never thought about it, E for exit. I guess that's a good way to remember it. And the filtrate, which is now inside the liquid inside the nephron, starts working its way through the nephron. In other words, it leaves the glomerular capsule and will now start to go into the other parts of the nephron. And here's a zoomed out view of that. Here you see the filtrate starting to move through the interior of the nephron, and here are the parts of the blood that were not able to filter in going up like that. All right, well, I now have to introduce yet another blood vessel. So notice that the efferent arteriole kind of goes up this way, and then here's this, it turns into this other blood vessel right here. That blood vessel that I'm showing sitting on top of the nephron has a name. It's called the peritubular capillary bed. There we go, peritubular capillary bed. The capillary bed that surrounds the nephron. Now, here on my cartoon, I'm just going to show the peritubular capillary bed exactly like that, just sort of sitting on top of the nephron. And that's kind of a lie. That's kind of a simplification. In real life, the peritubular capillary bed is very branched, and it intertwines all around the nephron like that. So just bear in mind that the real peritubular capillary bed is like one of those ivy or vines that you see growing around a tree trunk, right? It's all branched and surrounds the entire nephron. But just to keep my diagram simple, I'm just going to show it sitting on top. The peritubular capillary bed is pretty important to the functioning of the nephron because it's going to receive some of those filtrate molecules. In other words, the nephron's going to take some of those filtrate molecules and transport them into the peritubular capillary bed. That step is going to be called the reabsorption step. Okay, I think when I click the button, we'll start to see some of that. Here we go. There you see the filtrate moving through the nephron and blood flowing into the peritubular capillary bed. Oh, so I'm not showing any reabsorption yet, but hopefully I will in a second. Okay, so remember that the whole function of the nephron is to clean and balance the blood. And so let's go back up here to, here it is, the definition. So nephrons, these hollow tubular structures in the renal cortex that filter the blood. And so remember, that means where the blood is entering the nephron there at the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule. So these nephrons are for filtering the smaller molecules of the blood into the nephron. And then what happens next after the filtrate goes into the nephron is the nephrons reabsorb solutes and water back into the blood, back into the peritubular capillary bed. And reabsorption means transporting those molecules in the filtrate back into the blood, into the peritubular capillary bed. So when I start to click on it, you'll see some of those molecules moving from the filtrate back into the blood, going up there into the peritubular capillary bed. So you might say, well, what was the point of that? You might say, you know, those molecules just came out of the blood right here, and now the nephron's just going to put them back into the blood. You know, what purpose does that serve? Well, here's the thing. The nephron only reabsorbs the balanced amounts of water and ions and nutrients back into the blood. And so that means the blood that we end up with here in the peritubular capillary bed is going to be balanced. It's going to have the right amount of water and the right amount of ions and the right amount of nutrients. The nephron does not reabsorb any wastes, so none of that urea is going to be reabsorbed. And so that means the blood here in the peritubular capillary bed is going to be cleaned. Because remember, clean means that it doesn't have the waste in it anymore. And so, yeah, so the nephron only reabsorbs balanced amounts of water and solutes back into the blood. And so that allows the blood in the peritubular capillary bed to become balanced blood. And it does not reabsorb any waste like urea. And so that blood in the peritubular capillary bed is going to be cleaned blood. And so here's the whole kit and caboodle from the very start. Let's just sort of watch it play itself out. There's smaller molecules filtering into the nephron, and as the filtrate starts working its way through the nephron, you'll see some reabsorption starting here in a moment. There we go, yeah. And so it's only reabsorbing the balanced amounts of water, the balanced amounts of ions, and the balanced amounts of nutrients into the blood. And so we end up with balanced blood here in the peritubular capillary bed. The wastes like urea are not reabsorbed, so there's no urea now here in this blood, and so that's clean blood. And so that's what the nephron is, that's its job. It's cleaning and balancing the blood. The parts of the filtrate that are not reabsorbed, what are those? Well, those are the wastes, right? The little yellow triangles are the urea wastes, and any excess amounts of water and ions and nutrients. You know, the unbalanced part of the blood is also not reabsorbed, so it ends up here. And so that becomes the what? The urine, right? And so essentially the filtrate, as it exits the nephron and goes down the collecting duct, that's what the urine is. The urine is the wastes and any excess water and ions and nutrients that were not reabsorbed back into the peritubular capillary bed. Does that sound good in concept? Hopefully. All right. Well, so as it turns out, you remember the four parts of the nephron, the glomerular capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, and distal convoluted tubule. Each one of those has its own kind of special role in this functioning of the nephron. So in regard to the glomerular capsule, you know, the first part of the nephron there, we already talked about its role. It's involved in the filtration step, you know, letting the smaller molecules from the blood filter into the nephron. That's kind of its job. This part of the nephron right here, the proximal convoluted tubule, it specializes in reabsorption. As a matter of fact, you can see on the cartoon that it's doing a lot of reabsorption of the filtrate molecules. Matter of fact, there's a close-up of the proximal convoluted tubule right there. As it turns out, the proximal convoluted tubule is the part of the nephron that does the most reabsorption of solutes in water. So of all the parts of the nephron, the proximal convoluted tubule is sort of the king of reabsorption. It does the most reabsorption, and it can reabsorb anything out of the blood. All ions it can reabsorb, all nutrients, all water molecules it's able to reabsorb. But of course it does not reabsorb wastes back into the blood, because that would not be producing clean blood up here if wastes were put back into it. So yeah, it pretty much can reabsorb anything, but it does not reabsorb wastes. This next part of the nephron, the part that loops down right here, is the nephron loop. And the nephron loop specializes in just reabsorbing salt and water back into the blood. I'm not sure why it's a specialist that way, but it is. So it only will put salts and water back into the blood. Now, salt is sodium chloride, and it's actually made out of sodium ions and chloride ions. So to be a little bit more accurate, we should say the nephron loop specializes in reabsorbing sodium ions, chloride ions, and water molecules back into the blood. And there's a close-up of the nephron loop, and yeah, if we've watched the cartoon, we'll see sodium ions, chloride ions, and water molecules are getting reabsorbed out of the nephron loop back into the blood. Oh, maybe before I go on, I'll mention some older names. So an older name for the glomerular capsule is Bowman's capsule. And so you still see that in a lot of textbooks, so you should know that that's the alternative name for the glomerular capsule. And similarly, an older name for the nephron loop is the loop of Henle. And you still see that in some textbooks, so you should be familiar with that name also. Anyway, so the nephron loop specializes in just reabsorbing salt and water back into the blood. And the last part of the nephron there, the distal convoluted tubule, it can reabsorb any water and any solutes back into the blood. Here's a close-up of the distal convoluted tubule. Yeah, so all types of solutes and water it can reabsorb. But of course, it does not reabsorb any of the urea waste back into the blood, because that would not be cleaning the blood there. Okay, so remember, the distal convoluted tubule is the final part of the nephron, and the filtrate that was not reabsorbed, which is, pretty much the urine now, because it has the unreabsorbed urea and other wastes and any excess amounts of water and solutes. Those get dumped into this tube right here, the tube I'm showing in brown, and that's called a what? Remember? Begins with a C. Collecting duct, thank you. Yeah, so the filtrate that's unreabsorbed gets dumped from the nephron into this collecting duct. But as it turns out, the collecting duct also does a little reabsorption of substances back into the blood. It's like it wants to get in on the act. Maybe it's jealous of the nephron. And so it does a little bit of reabsorption of water and salt back into the blood. And I think when I click next, we'll have a close-up of the collecting duct there. Here's the collecting duct, and there's the peritubular capillary bed next to it. And yeah, you'll see water and sodium ions and chloride ions being reabsorbed back in. Here's a quick review question. Which region of the nephron also specializes in salt and water reabsorption? The who? Nephron loop, yeah. So in that sense, the collecting duct is emulating the nephron loop in that they both specialize in water and salt reabsorption back into the blood. Awesome. All right. So notice what we have here is we have cleaned and balanced blood here in the peritubular capillary bed, and I'm showing that blood, clean and balanced blood, going down here in this direction. And we also have the filtrate, which has now exited the nephron, going down inward in the peritubular in the in the collecting duct. So where do those go? Well, the cleaned and balanced blood at the end of the peritubular capillary bed, that eventually exits the kidney in the renal vein. So the blood at the end of the peritubular capillary bed is clean and balanced blood. That blood that you see there going down at the end of the peritubular capillary bed, those tiny little branches of the peritubular capillary bed eventually merge with each other to form little veins called venules, and then those venules in the kidney eventually merge with each other to form the renal vein, and that carries the clean and balanced blood out of the kidney. Here we go. There, you see it in blue right there, right? So all those little branches of the peritubular capillary bed form these little venules, which then all merge together to form the renal vein, which carries the clean and balanced blood out of the kidney. All right, so that's where that clean and balanced blood goes. What about the filtrate that's going down in these collecting ducts? Well, the collecting ducts, before I tell you where that goes, let me first mention one more thing about the collecting duct. So here in this cartoon, I'm showing this collecting duct as just connected to this one nephron right there. But that's a bit of a simplification. Each collecting duct is actually connected to several nephrons. So here's one nephron putting its filtrate into this collecting duct. But yeah, like I said, each collecting duct is actually connects to several nephrons, and they all dump their filtrate into that one particular collecting duct. I was trying to think of an analogy to this. What I came up with is this. If you think of the street in front of your house, underneath that street is one big sewer pipe, and your house and all the other houses on your street connect to that same sewer pipe. It's kind of a common waste disposal tube. Well, that's the way to think of each collecting duct. Each collecting duct is connected to several nephrons. Okay, but the question is, well, what happens to this filtrate when it gets dumped into this particular collecting duct? Well, getting back to this big view of the kidney here, notice in the medulla of the kidney, in this kind of mid-region of the kidney, there are these kind of triangular-shaped, stripy-looking things. Each one of those is called a renal pyramid. So like here's a renal pyramid, here's a renal pyramid, renal pyramid, renal pyramid, renal pyramid, renal. And those renal pyramids are bundles of collecting ducts. And so, when the nephrons dump their filtrate into collecting ducts here in the cortex, those collecting ducts go from there through the medulla down to this hollow part of the kidney right here. And so that's where the collecting ducts are. That's where they go, from the cortex through the medulla down to this hollow part right here. And yeah, the collecting ducts are bundled together into these triangular shaped areas called renal pyramids, or saying the same thing a different way, each renal pyramid is a bundle of collecting ducts. And so as the filtrate comes downward through all those collecting ducts, when it reaches this hollow region at the end of the collecting ducts, at the end of the renal pyramids, the urine just sort of drips out the end of the collecting ducts and fills up this hollow region right there of the kidney. So the renal pyramids of the medulla are basically clusters of the collecting duct, and as the filtrate comes down through those collecting ducts, it just kind of drips out of the bottoms of the renal pyramids into this hollow region. Oh, incidentally, the hollow region of the kidney is called the renal pelvis. And so we see the urine dripping out of those collecting ducts and pooling here in the renal pelvis. Incidentally, only when it exits the collecting ducts and goes down to the renal pelvis, only then do we officially get to call it urine. Before, when it was inside the nephron and inside the collecting duct, we have to call it filtrate still. But as soon as it exits the collecting duct and drips down in here, now we get to officially call it urine. Awesome. Okay. And then, yeah, the urine collects here in the renal pelvis. And then where does it go from there? Well, it drains down into these exit tubules from each kidney. Anybody remember what the exit tubules are called? Ureter, yeah, very good, yeah. So each kidney has its own ureter where the urine there that's in the renal pelvis drains downward and eventually goes from there to the bladder. Here you see it. Here's the person's left kidney, the right kidney. There's their left ureter coming down from their left kidney. Here's their right ureter coming down from their right kidney. And both ureters connect to this organ right here, which is called the urinary bladder, or just the bladder for short. Let's see. Oh, now I'm on the bladder here. Well, let me see if I can go back for just 1 second. There we go. I'll just let this play for just a moment. So I pretty much covered everything I'm going to cover now for the nephrons and how they work. Any burning questions before we leave the nephrons? I know that they're kind of a complicated little tubule, but hopefully you get the sense of how they operate. Well, let me just do one quick final recap with their definitions. So the tubular structures in the renal cortex, you know that. They have this filtration step where the small molecules from the blood enter the nephron, but they also have this reabsorption step where the molecules from the filtrate are selectively put back into the blood there, the paratubular capillary bed, and none of the wastes and only balanced amounts of water and ions and nutrients are reabsorbed. All right, well, so if we don't have any nephron questions, let's keep following the urine. So the urine, pools there in the renal pelvis of each kidney, then exits the kidney, it drizzles down into these ureter tubes. Let me pull up the next part of your lecture outline here. All right, so ureters are the tubes that carry the urine downward from each kidney, from the renal pelvis of each kidney, and they carry the urine downward onto that structure there, which is called the urinary bladder, or you can just say the bladder. Oh, incidentally, just looking at this, you might at first assume that it's just gravity that's moving the urine down through the ureters towards the bladder. But it's not just gravity. There's also peristalsis. And you might remember the term peristalsis from when we talked about the digestive system. Peristalsis is where the smooth muscle in a hollow organ squeezes in a directional way to push substances through the organ. So let me give you a thought question. Why is it that the ureters use peristalsis to push the urine downward? Why not just let gravity move the urine? Oh, would it flow up? That's a good thought, but that's not it. Well, let me put it a slightly different way. If you relied on gravity, it would only work if you were standing upright, right? But when are you not standing upright? When you're sleeping, yeah. And so that's why the ureters have to be able to use peristalsis to push the urine towards the bladder, because for 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 hours, depending how long you sleep each day, you're not standing up, and so you can't just rely on gravity to move the urine down to the bladder. Anyway, so that's what the ureters do. Using peristalsis, they move the urine from the kidneys down to the bladder. And so now let's focus in on the bladder. Here you see it here with the 2 ureters connecting to it on top. Here's my homespun cartoon. There's the bladder. Here's the right ureter. Here's the left ureter. And you see the urine coming down. And so incidentally, there's a constant slow drizzle of urine down from your kidneys into your bladder. The kidneys are constantly cleaning and balancing the blood. So the kidneys are constantly generating urine, and so there's a constant drizzling of urine through the ureters down into your bladder. Yeah. Yeah. Stop reading my mind. Give me about 10 minutes and then we're going to get there. All right? Okay, so describe the bladder here as I said a collapsible organ. Does yours say expandable organ? I think I changed the wording. Anybody have that? I was just saying, does yours say expandable or collapsible? Oh, you don't have it. Expandable. Okay, yeah. So I think I changed the wording here, and I forgot to update. So yours says expandable, which I think is a better word. And so think of the bladder as being almost as if it were made of rubber. And so it's able to stretch to a larger size, which makes sense, right? Because, as I said, urine is constantly going to be drizzling downward. So over the course of several hours, more and more urine is going to get added to the bladder, so it needs to be able to stretch to a larger size. The bladder is a hollow organ, obviously, so it can hold the urine. All hollow organs have what type of tissue as their inner lining? Very good, epithelial. And so the innermost lining of the bladder is epithelial tissue, but most of the wall of the bladder is actually smooth muscle. What I'm showing in pink there represents the smooth muscle that forms the bulk of the wall of the bladder. Now, smooth muscle, of course, is a type of muscle, and it can contract. And so what we'll see here in a few minutes when we start talking about how urination works is that the squeezing inward of that bladder smooth muscle is important for the proper functioning of urination. It essentially pressurizes the urine to help the urine leave the body, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, anyway, so there's the bladder, and most of its wall is made up of smooth muscle. Here in black right here, you see an exit. Oh yeah, so there's the smooth muscle of the wall. Okay. Here in black right here, you see an exit tube to carry the urine downward out of the bladder. That's called the urethra, the tube that carries the urine downward from the bladder to the outside of the body. And where does it exit the body? Where does the urethra exit the body? In females, it exits the body near the vaginal opening, and in males, the urethra exits the body at the tip of the penis. Okay, so urethra, yes, the final tube the urine passes through as it exits the body. In other words, the urethra carries the urine from the bladder out of the body. Okay, so if the urethra was just a wide open tube connecting to the bladder, you'd be peeing your pants all the time, because the bladder would constantly receives urine from the kidneys. And if the urethra was just a wide open tube, that would just dribble down through your urethra, and you'd just be urinating in your pants all the time. And obviously that doesn't happen. And the reason why the urine does not constantly leak out of your body through your urethra is that there are some sphincters that block the urine from passing through the urethra. Sphincters are ring-shaped rings of muscle that can contract to act as a closed valve, or to relax to act as an open valve. And in fact, there are two sphincters that block the urine from passing downward from the bladder into the urethra. This one right here, which is actually right at the junction between the urethra and the bladder, is called the internal urethral sphincter. And the internal urethral sphincter is smooth muscle. It's made out of smooth muscle. Okay, yeah, so when it's contracting, that acts like a closed valve, so the urine is not able to pass down into the urethra. And when it's relaxing, then the urine can pass through. There's the second sphincter that I'm showing in a darker red right here. That's called the external urethral sphincter, and that one is skeletal muscle. So which one of the, don't peek. Which one of those two types of muscle, smooth or skeletal, is voluntary muscle? Skeletal, right. And so this is the one that you voluntarily control. When you go to the bathroom, you decide, hey, I need to urinate. That's the one that you control. That's the one that you relax to start letting the urine flow. What about the internal urethral sphincter? What controls whether that one opens or closes? Well, I'm glad you asked, even though you didn't, because now what I want to talk about is the urination process, how it works when we go to the bathroom, so to speak. The urination process you can just call urination, but it also has a medical term, another medical term called micturition. I usually just say urination, but you should know that it can also be called micturition. Okay, so here's the way it works. So, as you can see from the cartoon, urine is constantly going down the ureters and going into the bladder, a constant slow drizzle of urine. So the bladder, being an elastic organ, starts slowly stretching to a larger size as it slowly gets filled up with urine. When the volume of urine in the bladder reaches around 200 milliliters, a reflex is going to take place that makes the smooth muscle of the bladder walls contract. So how much is 200 milliliters? It's not a lot. It's about the volume of a cup of coffee. But anyway, when the volume of urine in the bladder reaches 200 milliliters, a reflex is triggered that causes the smooth muscle in the walls of the bladder to contract. And that pressurizes the urine, right? Here's the water in here. If I squeeze in on this water, I'm pressurizing that water. And so, when this reflex goes and the smooth muscle in the bladder contracts, here we go. It's pressurizing the urine. I tried to show that with those little arrows pushing inward like that. And enough pressure is generated that it pushes the urine past the internal urethral sphincter, the sphincter right here. Matter of fact, when I click the button, I think you'll see the urine now pushes its way past the internal urethral sphincter, like that. All right, so that's how the internal urethral sphincter gets opened. It just gets opened from the pressure of the urine, and the urine gets pressurized when you get around 200 milliliters or more of urine in the bladder because the smooth muscle contracts. Do you pee in your pants right then? No, because you have that second sphincter, right, the external urethral sphincter, which is still closed. But what has happened is you get the urge to urinate. When that reflex occurs and the urine gets forced past the internal urethral sphincter, so the urine is now pressing against the external urethral sphincter, that's when you feel that you get the urge to urinate. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because remember that external urethral sphincter is voluntary, skeletal muscle, and so you have to consciously control when skeletal muscle is contracting or relaxing. And so that's why you feel the urge to urinate, because you now have to use some conscious control to keep that external urethral sphincter shut. Otherwise, you would urinate in your pants. Now, at this point, it's only about 200 milliliters of urine. At this point, it's not a strong urge to urinate. How badly you feel you have to go depends on how strongly the urine is being pushed against the external urethral sphincter. And so this is just the start of it. And so you would just think, I should go to the bathroom eventually. But the urge gets stronger and stronger as more urine accumulates inside the bladder. So there's more and more pressure against your poor external urethral sphincter. And so, if you don't go to the bathroom for a couple of hours, you really saying, gee, I need to go to the bathroom soon or I'm going to lose control here. And so that's you working harder and harder to keep this external urethral sphincter clenched shut against the increasing pressure. Now, obviously, there'd be a limit, right? Because eventually so much pressure would occur that you would just lose control. You wouldn't be able to keep this clamp shut, and then you would wet your pants. No, we obviously don't do that, or at least not purposely on a regular basis. And so eventually, when it's convenient, you find a bathroom, and when you go to the bathroom, you relax your external urethral sphincter, which means it opens. Now the urine can flow freely out of your body down into the toilet, and you see the bladder then is now draining that urine, and then you're back to the starting point of essentially an empty bladder. And then the process begins all over again. The urine continues to dribble in there slowly. Ooh, let me go backwards a little bit. Go back. And when it reaches 200 milliliters again, smooth muscle contracts to pressurize it, pushes the urine past the internal urethral sphincter, so now it's pressing against your external urethral sphincter. You start to feel the urge to urinate, but not strongly yet, but it gets stronger as more urine accumulates. And then when it's convenient, you go to the bathroom, relax your external urethral sphincter, and then the urine flows out of you. Great stuff. All right, so that's micturition. That's the way the urination process works. Before we go on, I want to mention a couple of instances where urination process does not work the way it's supposed to work, and these are called incontinence and urinary retention, and they're sort of opposite problems. Urinary retention is where you can't start a urination. You're just not able to begin a stream of urine. You can't urinate, basically. And incontinence is the opposite. Incontinence is where you can't control the urine coming out of you, so you wet your pants. So let's do urinary retention, the inability to start a urination. One thing that can cause urinary retention are anesthetics. Anesthetics are the medications that the doctors give to us so that we don't feel pain when we're getting a medical procedure. A general anesthetic means where basically the doctors knock you out. Like if you're going to get a major surgery, they give you a general anesthetic, so you're completely knocked out during the procedure. And there's a side effect of most general anesthetics that it causes urinary retention. I don't know exactly why that is, but it is. General anesthetics stop you from your sphincters from opening, so you're not able to urinate. You have urinary retention. And that could potentially be dangerous because you might be under the effect of these general anesthetics for hours and hours, right? And so potentially your bladder could burst as a side effect of this urinary retention from the anesthetics. And so to avoid any danger of your bladder bursting when they have you under general anesthetics, they use a device called a catheter. A catheter is a small little plastic tube that they slide up the urethra. Here you see it right there. It slides up the urethra and goes through those sphincters and goes right into the bladder. And so when you're under the general anesthetics, the urine just drizzles through this catheter down out of your bladder, so your bladder never gets full. What happens to the urine? Well, they usually have a urine collection bag like you see right here. So here you see in this diagram, there's the bladder, and kind of a blue-gray, they have the catheter coming down through the urethra, out the end of the penis here, and they just have the urine drained from the catheter into a bag until the anesthetics wear off and they can take the catheter out. Okay, so that's one common cause of urinary retention, is a side effect from the anesthetics. Another is this, and this next one, enlarged prostate, only applies to males. This is a side view of the male anatomy. Here's the bladder right here. Here's the urethra, draining the urine out of the bladder. And remember, in males, the urethra comes out the tip of the penis right there. Well, right here, you can see the urethra is just exiting the bladder and going down right there. Right there, there's an organ called the prostate gland. There it is. And so that's one of the male reproductive organs. So females just don't have a prostate gland. And we'll talk a little bit more about the prostate gland when we do the reproductive system. But anyway, it's very common in males, especially in senior citizen males, for the prostate to grow larger. It's just sort of a natural thing that happens to it in many men. And as the prostate gets larger, it ends up squeezing on the urethra. And so, it's like a garden hose. When you're watering your garden, if you squeeze hard on the hose, then you can stop the water flowing through. Well, the enlarged prostate, by squeezing on the urethra, stops the urine from flowing through. So it's fairly common in elderly males, senior citizen males, that they have difficulty starting a stream of urine because their prostate has gotten so enlarged that it's squeezing their urethra to a very small size. And there are medications that the doctors can give to shrink the prostate. I'm not sure if they can remove it entirely, but they can fairly easily shrink it. So all that's urinary retention, where the person can't begin their stream of urine. The opposite is incontinence, where they can't control the urination, and so they end up peeing in their pants. This is, very common in young children. Kids wet their diapers and wet their clothing. So it's partially just that they haven't really learned to control their external urethral sphincter, so it's partly learning just to control that muscle. But of course, under a certain age, they don't even know that they're supposed to retain their urine and not pee in their pants. And so typically by age 2, though, they've learned to control their external urethral sphincter, and they're no longer wetting themselves. In senior citizens, they also sometimes suffer incontinence. And obviously, at that age, they know that they're not supposed to wet themselves, but they can't help it. What typically happens is they just lose the ability to control their external urethral sphincter. It's just one of the things of aging, that the external urethral sphincter muscle just gets weaker. So with many senior citizens, they say that they can normally stop themselves from wetting themselves, but if they laugh or sneeze or cough, somehow that can cause their external urethral sphincter to open up momentarily, and so sometimes they wet themselves if they're coughing or sneezing or laughing or whatever. And so they sell essentially diapers for senior citizens if a senior suffers from incontinence. Oh yeah, here we go. So the next part of your urinary system handout says urinalysis, and this means analysis of a urine sample as a medical diagnostic tool. In other words, analyzing the patient's urine as a way to figure out what diseases the patient might have. And I'm sure you've had this done to you throughout your life, at various medical checkups. They ask you to fill up a little cup with urine, and then you hand it to the technician or the nurse or their doctor, and then they take it to a laboratory somewhere and analyze the contents of your urine. So that's what urinalysis is called. It's urine plus analysis of the urine. And the reason why they're doing that is they can figure out what diseases you might have based on the contents of your urine. There are certain normal urine substances that you're supposed to find in the urine. And of course, all the substances in the urine come out of the blood, right? Because the nephrons make the urine from substances that come from the blood. And so normal urine contains water and nitrogen-containing waste like urea, and any excess amounts of solutes, like any excess ions or nutrients that were in your blood. So that's supposed to be in there. But there are a lot of, or I should say, there are abnormal substances that are not supposed to be in normal, healthy urine. Like I listed, blood proteins and blood cells and hemoglobin protein and glucose and things called bile pigments. And so if the doctors find these abnormal substances in your urine, that indicates that you might have certain diseases.
Now, you might be wondering exactly what sort of abnormal substances can be found in the urine and what sorts of diseases do those abnormal substances indicate. Well, here in Biology 6, here in the physiology lecture, I'm not going to go into very much detail about specific abnormal urine substances and the specific diseases that those substances indicate, because when you take the physiology laboratory class, that's when you're going to learn more about urinalysis. But that being said, I do want to mention as an example just one abnormal urine substance and the disorders that its presence in the urine can indicate, just to give you sort of a preview, just to give you sort of a feeling of urinalysis. There's the nephron. Let me skip over that. Okay, so this is a table that I stole from the textbook that shows abnormal urine substances like glucose, proteins, white blood cells and bacteria, red blood cells, hemoglobin in the urine, bile pigment in the urine. So these are all abnormal urine substances, and these are the names of the conditions. What's the name of the disorder when the person has each of these abnormal substances in their urine, and what are the possible causes of that particular abnormal substance being found in the urine here. And like I said, don't memorize this table. I'm not going to ask you questions on anything in this table except for the part about the proteins here, because this is the one that I do want to give you as an example of urinalysis of an abnormal urine substance and what it might indicate. Okay, so proteins are not normally found in the urine. They are an abnormal abnormal urine substance. And remember why. We're going to zoom in here on the renal corpuscle, which is where the filtration goes on between the blood and the glomerulus and the nephron here. So let's zoom in there on the renal corpuscle. Remember that there are several different types of proteins dissolved in the plasma of the blood, but those proteins are too large to filter into the nephron. Here's one of these plasma proteins, and yeah, blood proteins are just a little bit too big to filter into the nephron, and therefore you don't normally get any proteins in your urine. Okay, but here's the thing. If the blood pressure was slightly higher than normal blood pressure, that provides a little bit of an extra pushing force, and that extra pushing force from high blood pressure can make those proteins pop into the nephron and therefore can make proteins show up in the urine. And the official name for, I just called it high blood pressure here, but hypertension is the official term for high blood pressure. So if a person has hypertension, yes, that can make proteins pop through from the blood in the glomerulus into the nephron, like that. And yes, then the person would start having protein in their urine, and so that's an abnormal substance. Protein's not normally found in the urine. So yes, if the doctors find protein in a patient's urine, one possible cause is hypertension, high blood pressure. There can be a couple of other causes as well of proteins in the urine. Nephritis means inflammation of the renal corpuscle. So there are various types of things like bacterial infection of the kidneys that can cause swelling all throughout the kidneys, including in the renal corpuscles. Well, as the swelling occurs, the little gaps swell to a larger size. The little holes where the filtration occurs swell to a larger size. And so that can allow proteins to start filtering through. So what I'm saying is nephritis, inflammation of the nephrons, can also lead to proteins in the urine. And lastly, exercise can also cause proteins in the urine. They're not sure exactly how this occurs, but a good workout, heavy exercise, can make small amounts of proteins end up in the urine. Now, I don't want to dissuade anybody from exercising. Exercise is very healthy, and it's not a large amount of proteins that you use, and yet it is true that heavy exercise can cause a small amount of proteins in the urine. And there they go to show up in the urine. Okay, so let's review what we talked about here. Proteins are an abnormal substance in the urine. They're not normally in the urine. If the proteins are found in the urine, that term is called proteinuria. And what might cause it? Well, heavy exercise. They said physical exertion here. Pregnancy can cause high blood pressure, and so that's one also cause of proteins in the urine is pregnancy. But they also mentioned hypertension, which is abnormal high blood pressure. That can also cause proteins in the urine. And what they said here is glomerulonephritis. That's just nephritis. That's where there's swelling of the nephrons. Okay, as I said, you don't have to know about the other abnormal urine substances and what their causes are. That's the type of thing that you'll cover in the physiology laboratory. I just want you to know about the proteins and in the urine and their causes here. Okay, well that about ends this video. So this is the end of part 1 of the urinary system lecture. So now please continue watching part 2 of the urinary system lecture.